Okay. So anyway, aerobic cellular respiration. You don't need to know that equation. Here's what's going on with the respiratory system. It's tied into your circulatory system, cardiovascular system. The two work together. Oh, well, all your systems do. Okay, so the respiratory system, really ventilation is what I prefer. Ventilating your lungs, moving air in and out. Ventilation. Moving air in and out of your lungs. So breathing, ventilation. All right, so oxygen's coming in, well, air's coming in to your lungs. In your lungs, the pulmonary circuit sends out blood to your lungs. There's capillary beds in your lungs picking up oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. So oxygen moves into your blood, and then your blood, well, let's be specific. Oxygen moves into pulmonary capillaries. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of pulmonary capillaries into your lungs. So oxygen's in pulmonary capillaries, returns to the heart via pulmonary venules, pulmonary veins, okay, into the left atrium. Then it's going to get pumped out the left ventricle in the systemic circuit. So oxygen-rich blood throughout your body. Here we go to skeletal muscle fibers. Okay, they're going to do this scratchy mess you see right there, aerobic cellular respiration to get ATP. And they're going to produce carbon dioxide as a waste product. Okay, that's going to move in the systemic circuit in your venous blood. Okay, back to the right atrium through the vena cava, out the right ventricle, and out the pulmonary arteries back to your lungs. So what we're going to look at for the respiratory system, we're going to be looking at the structures of ventilation. So what's actually moving this gas in and out of your lungs? That's what we're going to look at. Okay. So we're going to look at these structures right here. I'll say your windpipe, but there's specific names to the different parts. And then we're going to look at the anatomy of your lungs. Are we going to look at this? No. No chemistry. Well, it's biochemistry, kind of, sort of, no. Biology, no. Okay, so what's a function of the respiratory system? Well, if we're going to look at the whole package, okay, what we're looking at, I told you we're going to look at the structures that are responsible for ventilation. Okay. So your windpipe, which consists of something called the larynx, and your trachea, and then we're going to look at your lungs. Now, while we're looking at those structures, we're going to pay attention to vasculature to some degree. So basically, the blood vessels that are heading out to your lungs, the pulmonary circuit, we're going to pay attention to them too. Okay. So they're responsible for oxygen getting into your bloodstream and carbon dioxide getting out. Okay, respiration, entire process of gas exchange in the body, consists of pulmonary ventilation, gas transport, gas exchange. So basically, get oxygen to all your cells. Why do you need oxygen? Aerobic cellular respiration. Generate ATP. Okay. and get rid of carbon dioxide. Okay. Respiratory system needs to do that. Why is there CO2 produced? Because that's a waste product of this. Okay, what else happens? Well, sound production has to do with air moving in and out of certain structures. Smell, olfaction, has to do with air moving in and out of your nasal cavity to hit little chemical receptors in the roof of your nasal cavity. Okay. The air that you take in, it better be warm and moist because your lungs will get dried up otherwise. Your lungs are inside on purpose. Okay, your lungs aren't hanging outside of your body. They're inside for a reason. Okay, so here's all the different levels of the respiratory system. Well, basically you have a conducting zone, just channeling air through. And then you have a respiratory zone. So conducting zone. Move air in and out of your lungs. Okay, the respiratory zone. Gas exchange. What does that mean? Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. Oxygen in your blood, CO2 out. Okay, well, don't look at everything at once right here and get overwhelmed. We're going to look at things piece by piece. Okay, so air is going in your nostrils, also called your nares. That's not a news flash, and you didn't need to take this class to know that. Some of us are mouth breathers, but ideally you should take air in through your nares. Okay. Air is gonna move into your nasal cavity. Then it's gonna move on through the nasal cavity. And there's a common chamber behind your nasal cavity and your oral cavity. It is called the pharynx. So air moves into the pharynx and then it gets channeled in a structure at the top of your windpipe called the larynx. Pharynx and larynx. And then air is going to move through your windpipe, your trachea. The carina, that's just where the trachea splits, the bottom. It's going to move into the trachea. And then air is going to split into two major channels. They're called bronchi. Singular is bronchus. Okay. And then air is going to branch into finer and finer tubes. So your lungs are almost like, these passageways that are moving air down into your lungs. Your lungs are pretty much a lot like a grapevine in the vineyard that's covered with grapes and has no leaves. So picture, if you will, a grapevine branching out all over with twigs and stems and just covered with grapes. That's what your lungs look like inside pretty much. If you tear that grapevine out, cut off the roots, so you just have the trunk, and some branches and grapes and turn that upside down, that's your lungs. So you have these conducting passageways to move air. Okay, there's your head. I don't want to draw it. So we move down. This is your trachea. The trachea is going to split into what are called bronchi. There's an initial split, it's like a Y. Left and right bronchus. Then the passageways are going to split into lobar bronchi. And then these are going to split into segmental bronchi. And then those are going to split into what are called bronchioles. And then bronchioles are going to split into terminal bronchioles. And finally, those are going to split again into what are called respiratory bronchioles. So we just have splitting, 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 splitting all over the place.
Professor, for the segmental bronchi, is it by chance also called the tertiary bronchi?
Yes. Yep, we have primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi.
Okay, thank you.
I don't like primary and secondary and tertiary. But yes, it's a different name. Yeah. So we start out with the trachea, the trachea is going to split into a left and right main bronchus. Yeah, those are the primary bronchi, but I like left and right main bronchus, or even left and right bronchus. Then we're going to split into lobar bronchi, which are also called secondary bronchi, but the lobar bronchi, you have lobes of your lungs. Your right lung has 3 lobes, your left lung has 2. The lobes are superior and inferior. Now, if your right lung has 3, there's also a middle lobe. Okay, so your right lung has 3 lobes, your left lung has 2. So the lobar bronchi, each bronchus goes to a lobe. How many lobar bronchi would you have in your right lung as compared to your left lung? Lobar bronchi, each one goes to a lobe. There are 2 lobes in your left lung, 3 lobes in your right lung.
3 versus 2?
There it is, just like that. 2 lobar bronchi in your left lung, 3 in your right, and that's it. Okay, then we go to segmental bronchi. There's segments of the lung. Don't worry about the segments of the lung. That's above and beyond. Finally, we end up with bronchioles. These are the finest of passages. Bronchioles split into terminal bronchioles or end up finishing in terminal bronchioles, and then we move into the respiratory bronchioles. But it doesn't stop there. The respiratory bronchioles are continuous with what are called alveolar ducts. So let's actually make this red. Respiratory bronchioles. I'll rewrite it for you so it's red. We go into alveolar ducts. And then finally, alveoli. What alveoli are sacs where gas exchange happens. They're these sacs. So that's why I said your lungs look like a grapevine turned upside down with no leaves. Oh, here at the end, we would have alveolar ducts, and then there's alveoli, all these sacs. And they fill up with air. And these sacs, called alveoli, they're wrapped with what looks like a fishnet stocking. Pulmonary capillary beds are wrapped around the outside of the sacs. And gas exchange is happening. So what I wrote in red and orange here, this is the respiratory zone. And up above, everything in black is the conducting zone. I don't care about upper or lower conducting zone. Who cares? It's just conducting zone. And then we have respiratory zone. It's pretty easy to see where the respiratory zone starts because respiratory bronchioles, they're named that. So that must be where the respiratory zone starts. Okay, so what does conducting zone versus respiratory zone mean? So what's happening in the conducting zone? What's happening in the conducting zone?
The air is going in and out of the lungs.
That's it. Air is just moving through. What's happening in the respiratory zone?
Gas exchange.
That's it. The end. So this is the fine branching. So it's just a branching of corridors and passageways to get out to these little sacs where gas exchange happens. So a single one of these is called an alveolus. This is singular. Alveoli refers to multiple. So that's what's going on. Now see this blue here that's on the outside of your trachea? Your trachea is wrapped around by rings of hyaline cartilage. And there's hyaline cartilage that moves along with, so we have a primary bronchus, so left main bronchus. A lobar bronchus, we have hyaline cartilage again. And we move into segmental bronchi. We still have cartilage. And a bronchioles, and no more cartilage. Okay. Terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveoli. So your respiratory passageways or ventilation passageways. So the conducting zone, it's held open with hyaline cartilage so it doesn't collapse. Held open with hyaline cartilage. But really, hyaline cartilage is going to be gone about the level of bronchioles. So here, no cartilage. Needs to be held open. You don't want it collapsing. Now, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic mess with your passageways. Okay. You can have what's called like bronchodilation and bronchoconstriction. Basically, your air passageways at the level of bronchioles, because there's no cartilage, that's where we have cartilage stop. Smooth muscle and elastic tissue. Okay. At the level of bronchioles, your airways can constrict and dilate. Open. Okay. Here's constriction. That's some asthma, asthmatic attack, and open. Okay. So at the level of bronchioles, your autonomic nervous system plays around with how much air you can get in. The parasympathetic brings about bronchoconstriction. The parasympathetic constricts your airways because you don't need as much air because you're sitting there and low light conditions digesting a pizza, watching movies over and over again. The sympathetic will open, dilate your bronchioles. The sympathetic opens your bronchioles up because you need as much air as possible getting in, because you need as much oxygen as possible going to your muscle because you have to run for your life. Okay, so let's look at your respiratory tract moving from the top down. Okay, so there's a lot of detail here. What we want to pay attention to are just a few things. So don't look at all this at once. Okay, as far as the cartilage goes that frames your nose, if you're going to be a plastic surgeon, pay attention to that. But I'm not going to pay attention to it. So I don't care about that. What I care about is the pharynx, and I care about this stuff in your nasal cavity and a couple other features. Okay, so you have your nasal cavity and you have your oral cavity. The two feed back into a common chamber known as a pharynx. Now the pharynx can be split into three divisions. Behind the nasal cavity is the nasopharynx. Behind the oral cavity is the oropharynx. And where your larynx is, which is the very top of your windpipe, we have the laryngopharynx. So we have three divisions of the pharynx, and you see them lit up, colored over here. Nasopharynx behind the nasal cavity, oropharynx behind the oral cavity, and laryngopharynx or laryngopharynx right about where the opening to your windpipe is. So there we go, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. So you have a common opening that's going to go basically going to channel air into your lungs or food down your esophagus. This is a bad design. People choke to death. But this is the design we have, and it goes back to when some fish way back when had a structure to hold air and vaginated off of their digestive tube. So it's a poor design, but it's the only one we have. Evolution doesn't make the best solution. It works with the best of a big pool of losers. And this is a bad design. All right, so that's the pharynx. Well, when air comes in your nasal cavity, remember those awesome projections off the ethmoid bone? The nasal conchae, middle nasal conchae. There's some superior nasal conchae we didn't have to try and spot. And then we had our own facial bone. It was its own bone, the inferior nasal conchae. So we have these conchae. You can see them, superior nasal concha, middle, and inferior. Okay. Here, here, here. Okay, you have a bony septum and a cartilaginous septum dividing your nasal cavity. So when we look through a skull, you know you have a bony septum. the vomer, and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. Conky. Basically, you have 6 conchi, 3 on either side of your bony septum. What these conchi make are channels, meatises. You have 6 conchi total on either side of your bony septum. What this makes are meatises. And we can name them. The top one's superior, that's the middle one, and we have inferior. Nasal meatus. So there's a superior meatus, a middle meatus, and an inferior meatus. What's the point of this? Air gets directed through channels. You have 6 tunnels in your nasal cavity that air is supposed to move through. So that's why you have these conchi. They're also called nasal turbinates. Mammals have this. I'm never going to throw nasal turbinates at you. Just I'm writing it down so you can see how it's spelled. These are turbinates. Okay, so superior, middle, inferior conchi give rise to the superior, middle, inferior nasal meatus, or meati. So air is supposed to move through these channels. You're supposed to breathe through your nose. Air moves through these channels, and these channels, because of the conchi, it creates turbulence. So air gets thrown all over the place. That way particles end up stuck in mucus inside your nasal cavity. It's to prevent particles from getting down into your lungs. And as air comes in through these channels, there's a lot of capillaries, so the air gets warmed up and humidity gets added to the air. So when you breathe in through your nose, the air is humidified and made warm, which is perfect for going down into your lungs. If you breathe through your mouth, you're breathing cold, unhumidified air, and you're not having particles deflected in a snot like they would be if they move through these channels in your nasal cavity. I'm a mouth breather because my nose is always plugged up, but it's not good. Any questions on the conchi, these nasal turbinates, and how air is humidified and warmed as you take it in through your nose? Questions on this? Okay. All right. Well, yeah, there's some other structures in here. Let's not get into that. You have some tonsils, like pharyngeal tonsils. These are just parts of the lymphatic system, but really immune system. It's just little pockets to trap bacteria, and you have white blood cells there. Okay, there's a flap. Okay, so your hard palate divides your nasal cavity from your oral cavity. Your palate. Your hard palate is formed by the palatine processes of the maxillary bones, your maxillae, the horizontal parts, okay, the palatine processes of the maxillary bones form the floor of the nasal cavity and the roof of the oral cavity. Posterior to the palatine processes of the maxillary bones is none other than the palatine bones. Palatine, Okay, I say palatine. Some people say palatine. Okay. The horizontal plates of the palatine bones are posterior, like there. Right, so that's your hard palate. Behind it is the soft palate. At the very bottom, well, at the very end of the soft palate, posterior, is something called the uvula. This is a little flap. When you swallow, the uvula moves up and seals off your nasal cavity. If you like to drink milk and laugh at the same time, you break that seal and blow bubbles out your nose. It looks like this. You have some cartoon character. Here's the teeth, their mouths open, their tongues coming out. Okay. You always see that little thing hanging down. Maybe there's a little cartoon character standing in their mouth, punching it like a punching bag. Maybe you've seen that. Okay. You have to watch old cartoons. There it is. Uvula. So it seals off your nasal cavity. Okay. Here's a micrograph to show you these turbinates. Okay. Superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae. And you have these meatuses, superior, middle, inferior nasal meatus, the channels. Okay, your nasal cavity. Inside of it, you have the olfactory epithelium. And it's just basically pseudostratified epithelial tissue. Okay, so what are the functions? Filtering, warming, and moistening incoming air. Okay, in the roof of your nasal cavity, you have the olfactory epithelium, pick up smell. And you also have paranasal sinuses, modify sound production. Once again, your paranasal sinuses, you have them in the frontal bone. Your maxillary sinuses are the largest of all. There's the ethmoidal air cells and sphenoidal air cells. What do? Help lighten your skull, make mucus, and add resonance to your voice. If you're stuffed up, you sound different. Okay, your pharynx again. I think we've pretty much killed the pharynx. We've looked at it. Nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. Okay. Heading off to your lungs, we have the larynx. Okay. It's the superior portion of your trachea. Okay, pharynx, food and air both come in there. Right, you swallow, this flap, the uvula swings up and closes off your nasal cavity. However, when you're taking in air, it comes in your nares, moves through the channels, superior, middle, inferior nasal meatuses. The air comes down and moves through your larynx down in your trachea.